This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
It's excusez-moi, what an appallingly unprofessional way to start a radio programme. There's even a button next to me that says cough on it. I didn't know it wasn't even a cough. It does say cough, doesn't it? Can we start again, please, Keith? Can you rewind on Global Player even when you're the presenter? Can you pause and thank you.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
It's 4 minutes after 10. A very good morning to you. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, which is a great relief because some amateurs sort of open programmes with all sorts of coughing and spluttering and nonsense. Thank goodness you're in the hands this morning of a consummate professional. And speaking of consummate professionals, George Galloway is the new MP for Rochdale. I haven't double-checked. I thought you could do it for me. Is that the first time a former Celebrity Big Brother contestant has been elected to the House of Commons? I appreciate that to go from the House of Commons onto Celebrity Big Brother, or I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, or Dancing on Ice, or the one with the diving, whatever. I appreciate that is quite a well-trodden path, but I didn't realise that it was like a kitchen door in a restaurant. I didn't realise it was hinged in both directions. I don't know whether George Galloway is the first former Celebrity Big Brother contestant to be elected to the House of Commons, but I'm fairly confident that he's the first person who has invited Rula Lenska to lap imaginary milk from his hands while wearing a body stocking and pretending to be a cat. I'm pretty confident he is the first person who's behaved thusly to be elected to the House of Commons. Well, I suppose we've got no way of knowing what politicians get up to in private, have we? But certainly he's the first person who has ever invited Rula Lenska to lap imaginary milk from his hands while pretending to be a cat on television to be elected into the House of Commons. And to be clear, I'm not suggesting for a moment that Rula Lenska gets herself involved in that sort of behaviour anywhere except on television with George Galloway. So, I mean, I read you a thing a moment ago that was posted in jest. It was posted as I think, a fairly timely reminder of the dangers of reading too much into an election result, a by-election result. But you know that I have various screens in front of me in the studio, and it is, of course, for political journalists, the only story in town. Henry Riley is still there, although we're going to talk to him at 10:30 because he wants to catch a train. If we were going to have him at 10:45, but he says that means he'd have to wait quite a long time for this is the sort of high level journalistic negotiation that goes on this programme. Henry rang Jake and said, "Oh, can you ask James if I can come on a bit earlier because otherwise I'm going to miss the train and I'll have to wait in Rochdale for another couple of hours." And Jake said to me, "Do you mind if Henry comes on a bit early? Can he come on at 10:30? And I've got him booked for the 45. We'll get him on at 10:30 because otherwise he's going to miss his train and he'll have to stay in Rochdale for a couple of hours." And I said to Jake, "Tell Henry that's absolutely fine. He can come on at 10:30. He can come on 15:15. Frankly, if the one before gets delayed and he thinks he can hop on it." So we'll be talking to Henry Riley, who's still there at 10:30 this morning, about what has happened in Rochdale. So the thing I read out in that was clearly written in jest is the idea that you know what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to extrapolate a by-election result into meaningful observations. That's what this morning is all about. Meaningful observation. In fact, why don't I get that bit out of the way early? Give me a ring now on 0345 6060 973 if you have any meaningful observations. If you have any meaningful observations. Did I completely misrepresent that moment on Celebrity Big Brother? It was Galloway doing the lapping, was it, from Rula Lenska? Honestly, today's show is an absolute dog's dinner, or indeed cat's breakfast, depending on your perspective. So, meaningful observations, please, on 0345 6060 973. I could just leave it there, I think. I'll just spend the next 7 minutes saying the phone number and then meaningful observations, please. Meaningful observations, please. Do you have any meaningful observations to make about the by-election result in Rochdale last night? Give me a call on 0345 6060 973. No, I did get it wrong. George was the cat. Rula Lenska fed George Galloway pretend milk. It was brilliantly horrible. Okay, so you may have gathered from my tone that I am not taking this by-election result desperately seriously, not least because Labour didn't have a candidate campaigning. So what it tells us about big pictures, I don't know. But don't please let any of this prevent you from ringing me immediately with your meaningful observations. 0345 6060 973. So I liked this. It's posted on Twitter by someone called Tom Freeman. If we project this result across the whole country, which is what everyone in studios today is doing very portentously. If we project this result across the whole country, then Labour will lose every seat in which they disown their own candidate and cease campaigning. So that's why it is not to be taken terribly seriously. There is an almost Faragian streak of self-publicity in George Galloway. It was ever thus. The man can speak. I don't know if you ever saw him giving evidence, I think, to a Senate committee in America when he was, for fans of oratory, and listen, I know his record is in many ways, to many people, pretty rancid. Nick did a fairly good job of reminding you of his greatest hits, George Galloway's greatest hits, for want of a better phrase. But the man's oratorical skills are quite impressive. And the only thing more, if you like, impressive than his oratorical skills is his capacity for self-promotion and making everything about him. And that is what he has done in Rochdale. And it has been successful. But if we were to look for meaningful observations, I think we would have to see this as quite an odd end to the political week, because it has been a political week defined in many ways by the Conservative Party's problems with Islamophobia. The Conservatives' very real and continuing problems with Islamophobia. I don't know if you were listening yesterday when we had our regular monthly phone-in with the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. But if you weren't, just allow me for a moment to tell you that I had never seen him like that before. I interview him every month, as you know, or rather you do. I put your calls to him every month. And he alluded to the fact that I sometimes ask him why, off-air, I ask him why he is not more vocal about the filth that he endures. I mean, you will have seen some of it on social media, but trust me, the stuff that actually makes its way into the public arena is nowhere near as bad as the stuff that doesn't. The security levels that he is at, because of threats from both the far right and Islamist fundamentalists, are, I think the highest of any politician in the country. So while Rishi Sunak talks about mob rule and various Tories complain very colourfully in the House of Commons about the threats to the security of politicians, the British politician who I think has the highest security level, or certainly the highest level of protection from a potential terrorist threat, is actually the one that Lee Anderson attacked and associated with precisely the sort of people that the police have to protect Sadiq Khan from. But he spoke yesterday of his heartbreak at what Lee Anderson has done, his heartbreak at what Lee Anderson had said. And it was actually very moving, unless you are, I suppose, unless you're just not very nice. Even a politician that you have no time for at all can reach points at which you have to have sympathy just from a basic well of humanity. I remember feeling sorry for Jacob Rees-Mogg when there was a mob protesting on his own doorstep and his children were inside. There are some behaviours that I think should transcend almost all party politics. There are a couple of politicians I would struggle to feel sorry for in most circumstances, but never in all circumstances. So the Tory party has had a nightmare week with regard to Islamophobia. And yet it ends with George Galloway making political capital out of the Muslim vote in Rochdale. I don't know how much of the literature you've seen, but it was absolutely clear what he was playing at. The entire campaign was built on both wooing Muslim voters and bringing Gaza into the front and centre of British political discourse. This is a letter that he actually wrote and addressed to the voters of the Muslim faith in Rochdale, opening with the greeting, Assalamu alaikum. And he wrote, "The last 130 days have shocked the Ummah to the core. To its core, the killing of thousands of our brothers and sisters in Gaza is a war crime, and Israel must be held to account. The political class have failed Rochdale, failed Britain, and failed Gaza. I expect as much from the Conservative Party, but the Labour Party under Sir Keir Starmer have betrayed Muslims, choosing instead to support Israel's genocide in Gaza." Now, that is not normal business. and neither is it very pretty politics. We know that the general election, when it is finally called this year, is likely to be the ugliest ever, certainly the ugliest in living memory. And we perhaps didn't know in full until last night that the Labour Party in particular was going to be coming under attack from both sides. You're going to have the Islamophobic Conservative Party, where ministers cannot properly describe what Lee Anderson has done wrong, because to do so would be to describe exactly what Suella Braverman has done as well. The Islamophobic Conservative Party will be coming after Labour, while George Galloway and his ilk will be coming after Labour for not being supportive enough of Muslim people. This is a really hideous moment, you know, because that describes an impossible political riddle. And if I were a Muslim, I'd be quite concerned about the way in which I am being turned into a political football that the people kicking don't really care about. So the Tories think that there is electoral capital to be accrued by accusing Labour of being too Muslim. And as people like Lee Anderson have demonstrated, they're supremely comfortable conflating Muslim with extremist, or conflating Islam with Islamist. It's a disgusting and dangerous practice, but 30p Lee and his mates have decided that it's worth doing. And then you've got George Galloway and his mates who've decided that there is political capital to be accrued by attacking Labour for, in their words, being complicit in genocide in Gaza. And I just don't, the only thing I don't know, there's lots of things I don't know. I don't know how successful an electoral gambit it will be for the Tories to go all in on the culture wars like this, even though I'm not sure they have much choice. The only thing I don't know is how big George Galloway's gang is. So there are posters going up in Ilford, in Wes Streeting's constituency in Essex, which say a vote for Labour is a vote for genocide. The appeal to Muslim voters in constituencies where their numbers are high is going to be grim. It's going to speak directly to the heartbreak and horror that millions of us feel at the unfolding events in Gaza, where yesterday Israeli troops opened fire on Palestinian people who were queuing for food. That's a statement of fact. Because there are no journalists on the ground, there's room for confusion about precisely what happened, with the Israeli government claiming that the shots were fired because the starving Palestinians were stampeding the aid trucks, claiming that most people dead were run over by trucks or crushed by each other. A doctor at the hospital to which most of the casualties were taken says it looks to him like most of them were shot, but because there are no journalists, or precious few journalists, allowed into the territory, it is impossible to be absolutely 100% clear about what happened. But we do know that Israeli troops opened fire on starving Palestinians crowding an aid convoy. And stories like that have become commonplace in the last few weeks. Stories like that have become, I don't think they'll ever be normal, but they have become commonplace in the last few months. And that's why there is a lot of emotion to appeal to. So I think, and I'm very grateful to everybody who's already rung in with meaningful observations about this, but I think the question we need to answer is, how big is this? How big an issue is this for Labour? How worried should Labour be? And I'm not sure it's even correct to talk about the Muslim vote here. How big an electoral issue is Gaza going to be for Labour? Now, I'm a little bit biased on this. I catch myself immediately reaching for damage limitation from Labour's point of view, not over the situation in Rochdale. That's a complete anomaly. But over the bigger picture, I find myself thinking that the numbers aren't big enough to move the dial. The kind of people minded to ring me and tell me that this is a huge problem for Keir Starmer and he's definitely not going to get my vote because of what's going on in Gaza, we're actually never going to vote for Keir Starmer at all. Or if you were, you would do so in the way that many people from the centre of the Labour movement voted for Jeremy Corbyn. You would do so while holding your nose. But it hasn't actually moved your needle at all. All it's done is confirm or embed your previous position. But I don't know, you see. That's my biases kicking in. I would like to believe that although I believe Keir Starmer should have gone further and faster with regard to calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, I would like to believe that it's not a matter of major electoral concern for him and his party, because the main alternative in most constituencies in England and Wales, would be the Conservative Party, who have moved less far and slower than the Labour Party on this issue. But I want to do two things. I want to make it clear this isn't just about Muslim votes. I can conceive of lots of people. In fact, when we have turned our phone lines this week over to people who've been on the peace marches, the pro-Palestinian marches, we've made a point of trying to work out whether or not the way they're typified by people like 30p Lee and Suella Braverman is accurate. And it's not accurate. There are some wrong-uns on those marches, but you show me a group of 1,000 people without any wrong-uns in it, and I'll give you the money myself. So how big an issue is Gaza going to be? Do you think, for Keir Starmer and the Labour Party at the next general election? And of course, the best way to answer that is for you to tell me how big a deal it is for you. How much influence is Gaza going to have on your vote? 0345 6060 973. With a side order, of course, because it is the morning after, the night before, a side order of meaningful observations about the result in Rochdale. So the broader question is about the relationship between your vote and Gaza, and the narrow question is about meaningful observations regarding the result in Rochdale. It's 10:20.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
23 minutes after 10. Okay, I said I'd get you to do some of the heavy lifting. It's Friday after all. I've had a big week. I'd quite like to do a phone-in about the royal family, but I don't know what the correct question to ask is. If you can come up with a good question to ask about the royal family, we'll do a phone-in on it after 12 o'clock, all right? So you can text 84850 or indeed WhatsApp me on 0345 6060 973. And if you come up with I don't want to say respectful, but we are talking about two poorly people. So because respectful sounds like deferential. But I think respectful in the context of, humane, nice behaviour, a nice question, a well-phrased question, then we'll do it. But otherwise, I can't quite see a way into it. Let's get back to the politics. Ray's in are we talking to Ray in Vauxhall? Ray is in Vauxhall. Ray, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hi there, James. I was saying to your researcher, I called this a couple of weeks ago on Sheila O'Brien's show, where just after Azir Ali got removed, I made the point that I expected Galloway to take the share of that vote and possibly...
I don't know that necessarily makes you the John Curtis of Vauxhall, Ray. It was pretty blooming obvious. But what do you think? I mean, meaningful observations about the bigger picture, if you
Okay, here's my observation. Yes. I don't think this is going to be a Labour problem. I think this is purely a Starmer problem. And I say that because I think that... people who voted for Galloway have an issue with Starmer with his background, so-called background, because typically the Labour Party has never really been a friend of Israel, their tactics, their policies in Palestine. But I think at this point, people suspect that Starmer is swinging that way for the first time and taking Labour that direction. Even if you go back to Ed Miliband, he was a Jewish leader, but even he criticised Israel for their last invasion of Palestine, I think in 2014.
Starmer's moved a lot since October. I mean, the longer it's gone on and the more the killing has escalated, the more his position has shifted up to and including a call for a ceasefire in an amendment in the House of Commons. But you might be right. It might be too little too late. I don't know that you could call a Labour a Starmer problem and not a Labour problem. I think when you're the leader of the party, as you just proved when you cited Ed Miliband, it's impossible to separate the two. You're not going to be able to campaign as a Labour candidate in opposition to Starmer's perspective on Gaza. You might hope that voters don't bring it up on the doorstep. Also, renaming Sheila Fogarty Sheila O'Brien. I know it happens on the radio. People get a bit nervous, but just to be absolutely clear, there is no news in that department from either of us. In fact, it would probably come as a bigger shock to my wife, Mrs. O'Brien. Take care, Ray. Dina's in Cheltenham. Dina, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
I have always voted Labour, and I will not be voting Labour because of Keir Starmer's very late response to what's going on in Gaza.
But it's the correct response, but it's late.
Leaps and bounds,
yes.
But he hasn't responded soon enough, and it's a matter of humanity. The lack of humanity from the two leading parties is causing outrage amongst lots of people that don't have relatives in Gaza. I'm talking about native-born British, Scottish, Welsh people. It's refreshing to see that we're going to have a different voice in Westminster.
Okay. He was endorsed by Nick Griffin.
I don't want to get into that because
you have to, because you just said you welcome his voice because you're in the same camp as Nick Griffin, Dina. You both welcome this new voice in Westminster. I just wondered if you'd reflect on that for a minute.
I abhor Nick Griffin, and I don't.
But you both welcome this new voice in Westminster.
Not because, and I don't think he has endorsed Nick Griffin.
Nick Griffin endorsed George Galloway.
He's just jumping on the bandwagon. I don't think it's reversed. I don't think George Galloway supports anything that Nick Griffin
George Galloway's huge victory in Rochdale is a great result, not just because he'll be an eloquent voice in the House of Treason against Zionist ethnic cleansing, NATO aggression against Russia, austerity and net zero carbon hysteria. The result also shows that we're moving from the old two-party class divide to a society where tribal lines count. While white people, the English especially, are slow learners, they will follow the Muslim lead eventually. Listen, it's not your fault that you weren't aware that he'd been endorsed by the former leader of the British National Party, but I think it should possibly give us all pause to reflect on the question of whether you might have a point to make, but George Galloway is not really the proof of the pudding that you want.
He's not the proof of the pudding that I want, but he is a voice that is, other than the SNP, that has been muffled in Westminster. And you can
not
see
true. Jess Phillips resigned the whip in order to vote for a ceasefire with the SNP. She gave up her job as a junior minister. Now there's a voice in Westminster that doesn't come with the endorsement of Nick Griffin.
And I support Jess Phillips' stance, but
she wasn't muffled by anyone, was she? In fact, none of the Labour frontbenchers who voted for that original SNP motion were muffled.
But I'm going back to Keir Starmer's decision and the voice of the Labour Party as a whole. He did not come out and ask for a ceasefire soon enough.
No, I hear you.
You can see what's going on now in Israel. And just yesterday, the 100 deaths, where now food trucks. I know we do not know the true story. We have got no journalists.
Oh, we are forced by the failure of Israel to allow journalists into Gaza to say that there is still a lack of certainty over how the people died after the Israeli army opened fire on starving Palestinians trying to get their hand on some food. So I mean, you can phrase these things as cautiously. Or as incautiously as you want. I've got to go to the news because Henry Riley's got a train to catch. I don't know if you heard me mention that earlier, Dina. So he's going to be standing at Rochdale Station. People are going to be pointing at him. But when did it become too late? And I know that's a tricky question, and you don't have to answer it because I've kind of ambushed you with it. But when did it become too late? Because it would have been wrong to tell Israel not to respond to the terror attack. But so when did it become? And then there needs to be a period of grace where you might have wished he had done it, but you understood why he hadn't. When did the point come where you thought it's too late now? Whatever he says tomorrow, today is too late.
When it became very clear that the Israel's, the IDF, Netanyahu's sole aim was collective punishment, and Keir Starmer did not out Netanyahu.
And you can't put a date on that, really? And that's not a criticism. I don't think I could either. If I agreed with your analysis, I'd struggle to put a precise date on when it kicked in.
Well, again, it goes back to the fact that we've got no journalists on the ground reporting. So
there are some, but
are always going to deny any figures that come out and say that they are Hamas figures. But even if we go on IDF's assumption that they have killed 12,000 Hamas or whatever, it is still collective punishment when we look at the children's lives and the mothers' lives.
Okay, I'm glad we had this conversation. I'm glad that you... Well, not glad that you didn't know about Nick Griffin, but I would urge everybody thinking that George Galloway is good news for whatever it is they believe to be a little bit clearer on what it is that George Galloway believes or indeed doesn't believe. But I don't want to sound patronising. We'll hear it live from Rochdale after the very latest news headlines with Tom Harrigan.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:36 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I'm such a lovely colleague. I'm just doing a little bit of research on behalf of Henry Riley, who of course is in Rochdale for LBC, covering last night's by-election results. And Henry Riley joins me live now. Mate, I thought I'd check trainline.com for you. But there don't seem to be any trains direct from Rochdale to London. What's happened?
Yeah, I found this out quite frustratingly about an hour or so ago because I did buy a return ticket, but there's no trains from Rochdale because Northern are on strike. So
yes.
I'm going to have to get to Manchester Piccadilly, but the tube takes about 3 days, or the tram, sorry. So I'm probably going to have to get a taxi to tram.
Can we afford that? Can we afford a taxi at the moment? I haven't checked.
You've kindly offered to foot the bill, but I
think the wires have got a bit crossed. I said I'd ask if there was anyone listening in Rochdale who could give you a lift.
Could chip in. Well, that's always welcome. A lift or anyone to chip in would be great. But
okay.
I'm determined to make it back to London at some point.
But on the plus side, it means we get you for a little longer than we would have had if you were dashing for a train at 10:45.
Well, absolutely. And what's not to like?
Well, let's fill our political boots then, Henry Riley. What is going on in Rochdale?
I'll be honest, James, it was genuinely one of the most bizarre nights of my life. So, it finished at around 4, and the actual sort of meat of the night, where we were in a Suzuki car garage with George Galloway giving a victory rally from inside, alongside some sort of plush cars. It's genuinely an extraordinary night. So, he declared victory, indeed his campaign team, at 1 minute past 10, which is just after the polls had closed. And we were all a bit bemused by that, but opposition parties and indeed Galloway's team was saying, no, this is absolutely the case. Everyone we've knocked on today, certainly the vast majority, say they are voting for George Galloway. And clearly it was a huge win for him, over 12,000 votes. 39.7% was the turnout, which was slightly higher than people had expected, because there is a lot of apathy, even speaking with voters this morning, a lot of apathy from people in this seat who feel it hasn't covered Rochdale in an awful lot of glory. Curiously, that was the exact same percentage that Mr Galloway got as well, 39.7% of the vote. And at around 3 o'clock this morning, he addressed supporters after he'd won.
Keir Starmer, this is for Gaza. You have paid and you will pay a high price for the role that you have played in enabling, encouraging, and covering for the catastrophe presently going on in occupied Palestine in the Gaza Strip.
And it's genuinely one of the busiest counts I've been at, not just within the hall, but outside. There are a huge number of people, hundreds, who actually didn't have any accreditation to get in, but wanted to be there or indeed in and around the area, primarily from Mr Galloway's campaign, because they felt this was a political earthquake. Just after he'd won, just after that speech, a snippet of which you've just heard, I caught up with Mr Galloway. You spoke once about bumping into Tony Blair in the toilets of Parliament and saying something to his face. If that happens with Keir Starmer, what would you say to him?
It was actually outside the toilet, in the library corridor to be precise, and 2 weeks before the Iraq war. And everything I warned them about came to pass. Tony Blair didn't take my advice, and Keir Starmer wouldn't either. But if I do bump into him, I'll definitely give him a piece of my mind.
What would you say?
I'd say that the course of action you have embarked upon in your, to quote him, unqualified support for Israel, without qualification, he said, is going to lead your party to disaster. Your abandonment of traditional Labour values, your embrace of neoliberal economics and imperialist politics abroad is going to be the death of your party, and it richly deserves it.
I also challenged Mr. Galloway after the campaign against anti-Semitism put out a statement saying that they were dismayed by the result. They said he was a beta to the Jewish community. And at one point, James, it was rather tense at the count because there have been long-running divisions between Mr. Galloway's camp and the Workers' Party, which he'll now represent in Parliament, and the Reform Party. That is the party led, of course, by Richard Tice. Nigel Farage is the honorary president of that particular party. Earlier in the night, Richard Tice had told me categorically it was not a free and fair election. I put that charge to George Galloway.
I'm not sure I want to dignify Richard Tice's comments with an answer. He should know, though, that I kept the text on my telephone that he sent me very recently asking me to be the Reform Party's candidate in a parliamentary by-election. I wouldn't have wanted to publish that, but if he doesn't stop telling lies about me, I'll tell the truth about him.
So Mr. Galloway alleging there that Richard Tice had asked him very recently to be a Reform candidate. Of course, Mr. Galloway did campaign, did vote for Brexit. And so in terms of that one issue, they are certainly aligned. It doesn't seem like there's an awful lot else that would unite them politically. But James, two other notable things that happened? David Tully, an independent, came virtually out of nowhere and ran a really impressive campaign. He runs a local car dealership and also they fix cars as well. And he's very popular locally. He's a season ticket holder at Rochdale Football Club, and he ran a real grassroots campaign and came a very admirable second. And lastly as well, it was a bit of a disaster for Reform UK. Simon Danczuk, very high-profile candidate. He was the MP here, twice elected on a Labour ticket, standing this time for Reform UK. And at the start of the night, various people in the party were actually telling me they thought he could pip the Tories. The Tories came third here. They thought he could finish second, if not third. They actually came sixth, with Mr. Danczuk narrowly holding on to his deposit, just over 6% of the vote.
Was the lad from Lewis who wasn't Lewis involved in this one, or has he been too busy in court?
No, so the Reclaim Party, led by Lawrence Fox, I think is who you're alluding to.
That's the fella.
That's him. They did not stand a candidate in this election, and as far as I'm aware, they didn't endorse anyone either. So
do we know?
Not involved.
And obviously, it's perfectly possible that he doesn't even know himself. But do we know what Richard Tice meant when he talked about the election not being free or fair? I mean, at first glance, it sounds a bit Trumpian, that. But do we know what he's talking about?
Well, he told me there were a few reasons why he said that. Firstly, he felt that there was intimidation going on from within the campaign. Now, he referred a matter to Greater Manchester Police where there was an alleged death threat to Simon Danczuk. So he was referring to that. But also, James, he made a real play of the postal vote situation, because it was a very high postal vote turnout this particular election. Certainly by the bundles that were coming in, it seemed very high. And Richard Tice was saying that actually the Reform Party want to crack down on postal voting, and he was suspicious that the way the postal votes were done was in a manner that he didn't feel was particularly democratic. So quite a charge from Richard Tice, but he's still standing by that.
I mean, we can only speculate about how he would feel about postal votes if Reform had done well.
Yes, quite.
So possibly not the mode of voting that he's got a problem with, but the actual choice of vote.
Yes, I think that's probably fair. I mean, to say he was disappointed and to say Reform were disappointed, I think would be a bit of an understatement, because they were, I don't think they were ever expecting to win this seat, but certainly they felt they were getting quite a positive response on the doorstep. They were telling me that Simon Danczuk was being recognised often. Clearly that recognition didn't necessarily translate into people voting for him. But it all sort of stemmed this row, James, because there was a hustings organised where Simon Danczuk wasn't invited onto the stage, but turned up anyway, and essentially what still wasn't allowed at that particular hustings. And from that moment on, it's been sort of a bit of a Punch and Judy match between those two parties, with Rochdale residents sort of watching on.
Oddly, and I'm looking at two letters sent out by George Galloway's campaign. Clearly, the ground game had identified the differences between potential voters, because someone with another letter he sent to someone called Aaron that makes no mention at all of Gaza and goes in instead on issues like Brexit and transgender and all sorts of and even has the catchphrase "Make Rochdale Great Again." So possibly all things to all people. Finally, Henry Riley, Labour. I mean, it's almost impossible to say anything meaningful about Labour, except that they had an absolute nightmare in choice of candidate and subsequent suspension. So they were not really in the game at all, as the votes reflect.
Yes, that's right. Just on your point about the two letters, by the way, James, I did put that to someone in George Galloway's camp who gave me quite a bizarre analogy, actually, and said that it was reminiscent of Barack Obama, and they claimed that in the presidential election, Barack Obama sent out votes. So they were actually comparing George Galloway to the former US president, not ironically. And in terms of the Labour Party here, certainly, I mean, I suspect Keir Starmer can't wait for this weekend and for this by-election news to just completely go away, really, whilst he hasn't been involved. And, you know, ever since their candidates, they withdrew support for their candidate, Azhar Ali. It's certainly been a tricky matter. But actually, James, I do fear it could have been a bit worse had Azhar Ali actually won here, or because then, of course, you're into territory where he was elected as a Labour MP, despite the fact he's administratively suspended. Then they'd have to withdraw the whip. He would never sit as a Labour. So it could have been messier, but nonetheless, I think all the chatter that it was very close between Azhar Ali and George Galloway, perhaps Westminster people, journalists within Westminster, being slightly lazy on that, really, because they didn't realise that this strong independent David Tully would do so well, and actually Azhar Ali didn't just fail. I mean, he disappeared. He completely disappeared, despite the fact he was campaigning right up to the last day.
Thank you, Henry. A safe journey home. Vinny's offered 20 quid, and Sue says that if you go to Bury, the tram into Manchester Piccadilly is only 28 minutes. So there's some options
how far
there.
Bury is? How far is Bury from Rochdale?
Mate, don't say that out loud. We'd struggle enough trying to give the lie to the notion that we're a London-centric radio station.
In a car. But £20 would be.
I don't think you can take Vinny's money. I think there's Ofcom rules about that. I appreciate that they seem to be a little bit busy at the moment, but I don't think I can let Vinny give you 20 quid towards the taxi.
Okay, fair enough.
All right, mate. Stay safe.
Thank you, James.
Okay, maybe a pogo stick would do the job. I could just see, if you see Henry Riley bouncing through the streets of Rochdale, give him a friendly wave. Thank you very much indeed. What a bizarre by-election this is, something upon which we can all agree. More of your meaningful observations after this.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:52 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where I don't think this by-election result means much in the great scheme of things. But as somebody who is obviously keen to see the Conservatives replaced at the next election, and there is only one party can do that, I am conscious of letting my biases interfere with my, or rather influence my conclusion. So if you think this is significant for Labour, you're going to have to work quite hard to convince me, for the very simple reason that Labour weren't there. You can't even talk about Labour having a bad campaign, because they weren't there. The bloke who had the word Labour next to his name on the ballot is no longer a member of the relevant Labour framework. He has been suspended. So, he wasn't fighting. So I don't know how you can... possibly the most interesting story would be the independent candidate. The other constituency or another English constituency where independents are quite interesting is, oddly enough, Ashfield, 30p Lee's constituency, where the independents have made it absolutely clear he won't be welcome to run on their ticket. The Ashfield Independents, I think they're called, who secured quite a large chunk of the vote at the last general election in 2019. So what I want to know is whether or not this result means anything much. And of course, the one thing it might mean is that Keir Starmer has a very large Gaza problem with regards to your voting intentions at the next election. We cannot, nobody can. I'm not an opinion pollster. We can't put a number on that. We can't count that problem or judge the scale of that problem except anecdotally. But I'm still interested in the reasons behind your decision to move into that camp. And indeed, speaking of opinion polls, one published today by YouGov has Labour's lead steady at 26%, 26% lead for Labour. So certainly in terms of polling, Gaza hasn't touched the sides. But, what does that mean? 10:54. Yasser's in Harrow. Yasser, what would you like to say?
Hey, James, thanks for taking my call.
You're very welcome.
So with regards to the bigger picture that you're asking about, I'm a Muslim, I'm Arab myself. I'll probably be voting Labour, but mainly because the alternative is so much worse.
Yes.
I'm not going to vote for what essentially are a racist party, the Conservatives, as far as I'm concerned. So that's the reason I'll vote for Labour. So I don't think Labour are going to have a major problem in the next election. But I think the Arabs, just like in Michigan, America, we're not going to forget this. This is very upsetting to us, what happened here, and the way that, yes, okay, in the end, Starmer is calling for a ceasefire, but it just took him so long to get there. You look at other sort of even Jewish leaders, someone like Bernie Sanders, who's been asking for a ceasefire for ages.
Yes.
So it's very upsetting to us. And one other point I wanted to make with regards to the whole issue of anti-Semitism. I think it's we as Muslims and Arabs, we really, really resent being accused of being anti-Semitic. For one thing, as an Arab, I'm a Semite. Arabs are Semites. That's one point.
I know that. So I know you say Semite, you say Semitic, I say semantic on that one. We know what anti-Semitic means in the context of this discourse. It means Jew hate. It means hatred of Jewish people. Just as we know that Islamophobia means hatred of Muslim people. And there are plenty of people in various camps who pretend otherwise. I know you're not doing that, but I don't think that dictionary definition is actually helpful in this context.
Fair enough. I take your point. What I would say, however, is if you just look at history, just the last 100 years, sorry, but anti-Semitism is not a Muslim problem. It's not an Arab problem. Anti-Semitism is the problem of white men with blue eyes. It's not our problem. We're not anti-Semites. Our religion very, very clearly tells us to respect all people of all faiths, especially people of the book. That would be Christians and Jews. Okay. I was going to split another hair there and talk about how it's not mutually exclusive. You can have an anti-Semitism movement coming from white people with blue eyes, and you can have anti-Semitism from brown people with brown eyes, regardless of faith or whatever it may be. But I don't think you said anything that particularly needed to be challenging because you're speaking for yourself. Yeah, no, that's true. That is true. But I think even the anti-Semites who are on the left, let's say, and I'm sure that there are some, obviously, or anti-Semites who are Arabs or Muslims,
yes,
even their anti-Semitism, which is obviously wrong, I think it's a confusion because they confuse Judaism with the state of Israel.
Yes.
Whereas the anti-Semitism that comes from the right is different. They believe that inherently they are better than Jewish people, that Jewish people are just bad people, that Jewish people are controlling the world and all the other tropes.
Yes.
So it's even a different type of anti-Semitism. Like, I'm not excusing it, but it kind of comes out of ignorance, whereas the other type of anti-Semitism is it's akin to, say, how people treated black people, a couple of hundred years ago.
It is
they
exactly
felt that. Black.
Yes, it's proper. It's proper racism as opposed to a conflation of the modern state of Israel with the religion of most Israelis. I take that point as well. So. Why? I mean, I hesitate to ask this question, but I asked Dina as well. At what point did Starmer fail? Do you see what I mean? Because he couldn't have come out. No one would have expected him to come out on October the 8th and tell Israel not to respond to the terror attack of the previous day. And we asked a lot at the time about disproportionate versus proportionate response. And I asked a lot of people who were supportive of Israel's position to tell me when too much death would have occurred, and it was perhaps a little simplistic to put a number on that, in the same way that it's simplistic to ask you to put a number on this. What date? What was the point at which Starmer's position, in your view, became irredeemable?
I think, obviously, the first couple of days, you couldn't say anything. You had to obviously stand with, those who were killed in Israel. Fair enough. But if you just look at the history, and we don't need to go back far enough, look at the Great March of Return or all the other skirmishes that have happened. Just look at the history. We know for a fact that Israel will always overreact massively. Okay, in the Great March of Return, you had people just, demonstrating next to the wall, and they were all shot. They were purposely shot. There was that famous nurse who got shot.
Right.
So we know they overreact. So
I haven't got the history. I haven't got the history for that part of the conversation. But you're not really answering my question, except to say 3 days. So 3 days of supporting Israel after that appalling terror attack.
No. Support Israel. Even support them now. That's fine. It's not.
But not to do this. But you know what I mean.
No,
I'm talking
not to do this, yeah.
At what point did Starmer's failure to call for a ceasefire become politically salient for you?
When it was obvious that they were killing people indiscriminately.
Okay, so whether that was the revelations or the reports about the nature of the ordnance being used, the bombs that had no sort of targeting capabilities, or whether it was simply the death toll or the number of children. It is simplistic of me to expect anybody to put a precise pinpoint on this principle, just as it was simplistic of me to ask supporters of Israel's actions in Gaza to put a precise number on how many deaths would be too many. But that doesn't mean it's wrong to ask the questions, because I think that sometimes it's in the margins that you find the interesting ideas, isn't it? It's just gone 11 o'clock. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I could actually listen to a little bit more of this, but I shall take an executive decision during the news.
James O'Brien on LBC.
4 minutes after 11 is the time. Another poll, actually. So there's 2 polls that seem to have dropped today. And these are projections of what would happen in a general election. YouGov have Labour 26 points ahead of the Tories, 46% to 20. And Techni UK has Labour 21 points ahead of the Tories. That's 44 points to 23. So really, the question of how significant the Rochdale by-election result is close to becoming moot. Looking at those numbers, but sometimes the strangest things can change the weather, can't they? It means actually, just for politics nerds, it means that the constituency, the makeup of the House of Commons is now 348 Tories, 199 Labour MPs. 43 SNP MPs, 19 independents, which is up 19 from the 2019 general election, 15 Lib Dems, 8 DUPs, 7 Sinn Féins, 3 Plaid Cymru, 2 SDLP, 2 ALBA, 1 Green, 1, I don't know what that stands for, and then one Workers' Party of Britain. I tell you what, if this was a pub quiz, if you could name all 19 independent MPs in the House of Commons, I'd give you a pint for every one. As long as you got all 19. So there's only a prize. The only prize is 19 pints. And if you're teetotal, you're more than welcome to choose a non-alcoholic beverage of your choice. 19, can you have any independents? I mean, some of them have been suspended, haven't they? So 30p is an independent. I have to be is Brigden, Andrew Brigden, is he an independent? Or has he found a party to join? He was briefly part of was he part of the lad from Lewis who wasn't Lewis's party, or the other one, the one that isn't led by Nigel Farage? It's so hard to keep. We need Henry Riley. I need to get him off that tram and get him back in the studio. How many independent? Don't look anything up. Just text me to 84850. Independent MPs. Don't look it up, because that spoils everything. Let's just see how much we can do from a standing start. I've got 30p Lee and Andrew Brigden. They are the only 2 that I can think of. And don't text me to say that his name isn't Brigden. That's what it said on the Christmas card. That's what it said on the Christmas card. No one's going to send out a Christmas card, are they, with their name spelt wrong? So clearly that is his name. But is he an actual independent? It's the Alliance Party of Northern Ireland, isn't it? ALL. Thank you. You're absolutely right. That is the one that I missed. 7 minutes after 11 is the time. Sometimes a story is so clearly destined to provoke a lazy culture war flavoured conversation that I have to resist the urge to talk about it in that moment, because I would then find myself only talking about it to push back against the lazy tabloidification of a story that is probably a lot more complicated and nuanced than a headline allows. And that happened to me yesterday. So yesterday I was just about poised to come on air and start explaining why a play about slavery will have 2 out of goodness knows how many performances where only black identifying audience members would be welcomed. And it seemed to me a relatively straightforward idea that reflected the fact that if I was watching, for example, 12 Years a Slave while sitting next to a mate of Caribbean extraction, my experience would be slightly different from the experience I would have while watching it on my own. And therefore, his experience would probably be different as well. And I don't need my difference to be respected like that, but I think that if he wants me to respect his position on that, then I just would be happy to do so. So that's how I read it. It would be a bit like perhaps the families of Holocaust survivors sitting down to watch Schindler's List in a cinema where the management had gone to great pains to make sure that there were no descendants of concentration camp guards or Nazis in the cinema. And although that would be logistically a lot harder to ensure, it would seem to me on a point of principle or philosophically speaking, it would seem to me to be a perfectly reasonable and even desirable principle or idea. So that's why I didn't talk about it yesterday, because I didn't want to rise to the bait of, if you like, paid trolls. Yeah, usually elderly white men writing for newspapers like the Daily Mail and insisting that as an elderly white man, my understanding of black issues and the need for a black-only night at a theatre performance about slavery is complete. I don't need any influence, input or advice from anybody black. I am old and white and certain that this is a very bad idea. And I just, some days I'm up for that. And some days I just find myself thinking, come off it. Just get over yourself, will you? I'm not even engaging. But then Rishi Sunak, who is neither elderly nor white, got involved. And inevitably, for me at least, the timbre of the story changed. I must look that word up because it's one of those words I use without being entirely clear precisely what it means. Always dangerous to do that. Because Rishi Sunak has claimed that theatres who put on black-only audience nights are divisive, and he's insisted that productions should be open to everyone. I don't know how long the run is for slave play in the West End, but I'm fairly confident that 2 performances from the entire run constitute a tiny percentage of the total. But that doesn't mean that I should automatically presume that this is a good idea or necessary or correct. Just because people with whom I would routinely disagree think that it's a bad idea doesn't mean that I must automatically conclude that it's a good idea. And that's why I used the potentially clumsy image of me watching a film with a black friend, a film about slavery, and presuming that his experience would be different watching it in a room full of white people from how it would be in a room full of black people. And I use that sincerely, but quite possibly clumsily, because I don't know. I don't know. So I want you to explain it to me. I think the best thing you can do when you don't fully understand something is to ask the people about whom you are talking to explain it to you. And in some ways, as a phone-in host, that becomes difficult, because if you're a black person that thinks this is a stupid idea, you should probably have more right to express your opinion than I do, and yet it can't possibly cancel out the opinion of somebody who identifies as black. That, I think, is a way of including mixed-race people and not being too prescriptive. You can't cancel out their view. So then the question becomes one about access. And if there are, say, a couple of hundred performances, or 100 performances. So it runs for about 3 months. There are 100 performances, of which 2 will be at the playwright Jeremy O. Harris's behest, will be confined to or limited to people of colour, people who identify as black. So I'd like you to explain it to me. I'd like you to explain why it matters to you. Okay, and it's 12 minutes past 11. Evgenia Kara-Murza is joining us at past. She is the wife of the imprisoned human rights activist Vladimir, who, since the murder of Alexei Navalny, has become the most prominent political prisoner in Russia. Not a title he ever wanted, and not a title that Evgenia would have wanted for him. But if you've heard me talk about Vladimir Kara-Murza before, you know that I get flipping heck. I get very. I don't know why. Well, I know him. I've met him on several occasions. He's an incredible man, and I get quite emotional talking about him. So, because it's Alexei Navalny's funeral today, Evgenia has kindly agreed to join us in the studio. So that's coming up at past. After we've spoken to her, we may broaden the conversation out a bit to opinions of people that this story is not about. Because at the moment, this story is about people who would welcome the opportunity to watch a play about slavery in the company exclusively of fellow black identifying human beings. That's who the story is about. It's not about anybody else. It's not about me not being able to go, because there'll be 90-odd performances to which I can go. So I think, and I could be wrong about this, all right? I really don't think I am. But I just want to remind you that that's what the phone lines are for, to tell me why I am on 0345 6060 973. I want to know from people that this story is about what this idea is designed to do. Because I think that we probably all need help, whether you're reaching for a lazy opportunity to prove that you don't really understand what the phrase means, that if you've lived your whole life feeling privileged, equality can feel like oppression, and then people who perhaps somewhat lazily come at it from the other end of the football pitch and presume, because of all of the people who would defend 30p Lee, or thought that Boris Johnson was a good prime minister, or think the Daily Mail is a vaguely respectable newspaper, they're all convinced this is terrible. Even stopped clocks are right twice a day. It doesn't mean that it's a good idea just because all of the people that are professionally repellent think that it's a bad idea. So here it is. We can have, of course, Idiot's Corner as well. We've already got someone suggesting we should have black-only days on public transport, so that's fantastic. Idiot's Corner is open. I pull up a chair, put on the kettle, and sit down. I'm sure there'll be other people joining you shortly. But the people that this story is about are black people, or black-identifying people, who want to watch a play about slavery without having any white people in the room. And I simply want you to tell me why. I want you to tell me what the difference is, experientially, between watching it in a room which would be, given most West End audiences, which would be largely white, versus watching it in a room that is exclusively black. 0345 6060 973. is the number that you need. I can't put 10-year-olds in Idiot's Corner, Steve, but I can put their dads in Idiot's Corner. Apparently, Steve just asked his 10-year-old what she thought, and she said, isn't that what Rosa Parks tried to stop? Which is, A, almost certainly made up, and B, if it isn't, mate, it's your job to explain to her what Rosa Parks was actually doing when she refused to sit in the whites-only, or when she sat down in the whites-only part of a bus. There wasn't a play about slavery on the bus. There wasn't just 2 days in the year when there was segregation on the bus. It wasn't a story about racism. It wasn't an example of anything that Rosa Parks represents. It's about people who want to watch a play about slavery as descendants potentially of slaves in a room where they can be confident that there won't be any descendants of white slavers. So if you can explain that to your 10-year-old and then go to Idiot's Corner, to your non-existent 10-year-old, that would be great. 11:16 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, and we'll, I think, learn a bit about an outwardly quite difficult story after this.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 20 minutes after 11 and you are listening to James O'Brien, where the headline about black-only nights at the theatre can be used as a political punchbag. Indeed, Rishi Sunak has chosen to do so by opining that these nights are divisive. And we may end this hour agreeing with him. But at the moment, I'm interested in hearing from the people that the story is about, i.e. people who would like to watch a play about slavery in the company only of other black people. Shalina sent me a brilliant message. She says, the blackout nights are not divisive, James. The culture war is making this about skin colour and race. It's actually about shared experiences and shared community. You can imagine a women's only night for a play that is perhaps about the trauma of rape, or a play about the children of the British Empire that might have a night for the people who actually went through it. Sometimes those who have experienced something or whom it directly affects need to be in their own community. Why would anybody want to force their way into that? And Teresa tells me as well that many years ago there was a documentary about misogyny in pornography, including images showing a woman, I'm just going to say, being murdered in a particularly hideous fashion. And they held a women-only showing. It was really powerful and really necessary, particularly, Teresa adds, in the context of the conversations we've been having about Sarah Everard's murderer this week. So I don't really struggle to see why there might be a case for saying 2 out of 100 performances are going to be restricted in this way. But as I say, I think the conversation should at least begin with people about the people who this story is about. KK is in Leicester. KK, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Huge fan here. I just wanted to say, it's not divisive, but it's actually, it protects people. Yes, those who are comfortable to watch it with the white people or other people of other ethnicities are welcome to do that. A few years ago, a British friend of mine and her mother hired bought the Help. I don't know if you've watched the film, where it's got Olivia Spencer and Viola Davis as the help for white ladies who had children.
I haven't seen it, but it's a story of domestic staff, isn't it? And the relationship,
staff,
with the black domestic staff and the relationship with the white family that they looked after.
Yes. But then their living conditions were not as good and stuff like that.
Yes.
And these are good friends of mine, and we talk about anything.
Yes.
And they invited me to their house to watch this film, and my reaction to the film in their presence was not good. And at the end of it, I was ashamed. I shouldn't have been. And they were very sympathetic, but they were watching it from like we always say that with some experiences, if you go in a place, you as a white person, you don't experience some of the things that a black person might experience, like being asked their identity or being asked if they're really a doctor or whatever. It's the same thing, that their experience watching that film was different from mine, and I reacted so violently. And in some places, I was speaking even in my mother language in reaction to something that happened in the film, that it actually traumatized them. At one point, I looked from the screen to find them looking at me and asking, "What did you just say?" They were surprised. But I was just in that moment and reacting to what was happening in that film, that in the end, I would never do that again. I would not watch a slavery film with a British friend of mine. It's not good.
White British.
It's not good for me.
A white British friend of yours.
Yes.
Can we?
Yeah.
I mean, your contribution is already incredibly powerful and very helpful for me and for anybody listening with an open mind. But can we put into words why? Do we? Or are we just describing a sort of visceral reaction? Do we know why would it have been different if you'd been watching it on your own or you'd been watching it with other black people?
Because I don't know if it's visceral or it's something that is there that I just can't explain. Because even if you watch what's the other one, Django, what they were going through, it's almost as if I can put myself in that experience. It's almost like the boy in the striped pajamas.
Yes,
I would never watch it with a Jew person because I would feel so guilty that I don't want to be there to have those feelings with them, because it's either I would want to hug them a lot, just to say,
which is not encouraged in cinemas, KK. You can't go around hugging the other cinema goers, for good or for ill. Gosh,
I think it's just a reaction of it's because when you're watching those films, I don't know if you have ever watched a film where you feel like if you had survived in that time, you might have been that person going through that.
And that's why you mentioned the boy in the striped pajamas. I don't think Rishi Sunak would object if a screening of a or a play about the Holocaust, if they decided that for a couple of performances out of the whole run that they were going to try to ensure that the audience was exclusively Jewish. I can't quite imagine anyone struggling to understand that. So why do they struggle to understand this?
I don't know, because even I went to Austria, and I went to one of the camps.
Yes.
And walking through it, I even did it on my own without anybody. I decided to just walk through the camp and everything on my own, because I didn't know how I would react. And even though I'm not a Jew and I didn't go through that, but I could feel the presence of whatever happened in me. And it's the same thing with I'm not saying that I'm not trying to compare the things to say which one was worse or whatever.
I know you're
but
not.
It's the experience that the black people went through during slavery that I wouldn't want to experience with a white person looking. Because I think in a way
brilliant. I think you've explained this so perfectly, actually. Mm-hmm. I really do. And in the end, I was apologizing and saying, I know it's not about you. It's not you that I'm reacting to. It's that time, but it's because you are here. Please, for next time. And they know. I wish they... next time, get a Marvel superhero. Get a Marvel superhero. Get Spider-Man or something like that.
Exactly, something like that. And so that's just my contribution, that it's, please, people must not think about themselves about
But you also sound like a great friend as well. Bizarrely, in that situation, you were worried about the effect that the whole experience would be having on your friends, weren't you?
Yeah, no, I love them a lot. They've been brilliant, and I've got a lot of white British friends here, and I would protect them from my own experience of how I feel about black slavery and stuff like that. I'm happy to speak to other black people about it, but not to white people. Just because also sometimes I get the answer, it's not our fault, it happened then. And I'm trying to explain, no, I'm not saying it's about you. I'm not saying it's your fault. I'm just saying it's a thing that happened that we need to acknowledge it happened. It was a horrible time, and we need to, but sometimes people are not ready to face those things, to say, yes, it's not, you're not being blamed, but
I'm not sure you should have to feel that you have to put other people's feelings in but that's clearly the sort of person you are. Is that that's just how you are? You are worried about other people's feelings, but you've articulated why you feel the way you do close to perfectly. And in fact, if I read out a message from Emma, which sits alongside KK's contribution, I think that this subject makes perfect sense to anybody listening with an open mind. Emma writes, it's amazing the reactions you get from some when they're asked to decentralize themselves to make way for others. It's very tantrumy. Seeing themselves as the main character in every scene is a very colonizer attitude. Which brings us to Dan in Doncaster, who's been in touch to say, these blackout nights are not divisive, but call two of them whiteout nights and just watch the uproar. I look forward to your explanation as to why my opinion is wrong. Mate, I mean, I've got no idea what you're talking about, so I don't even know what your opinion is. You seem to be positing a completely theoretical idea which bears no resemblance whatsoever to the idea that's under discussion. I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt and say that you probably sent that before you listened to what KK had to say, and that will keep you out of Idiot's Corner for now, which is, good news. 11:30 is the time. More on this, if you would, because I think that the suspicion that the conversation needs to be about the people, needs to be with the people that this story is about, has been rather heftily vindicated by KK's contribution. Tom Harrigan is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
11:34 is the time. Yeah, I hope this doesn't sound silly or soppy, but that's why I come to work every day. Callers like KK's, just ripping the lid off a potentially very complicated subject and quite beautifully simplifying it for almost everybody listening. Andy's not listening. Andy's turned off, sadly, because he's never heard such left-wing drivel in his life. Which I shall take as a challenge, mate, next time you tune in. But this from Helena, I think, puts it quite perfectly. I was already fine with the idea of black-only nights, but that lady spoke so beautifully and with so much compassion and emotional intelligence. Why would we want to deny people like her the chance to process generational trauma in a safe environment? And Dave writes, I am a black man, and I genuinely wanted to call James to oppose the black-only viewing. However, after KK's call, I can see why it might not be a bad idea to have a black-only viewing. Her example with her Jewish experience changed my mind most. I'm happy she called in, as I was dead sure it was a wrong idea. Let's not over-egg this pudding, but if you have a topic about some people, the best thing you can do is talk about that topic to those people. As a middle-aged white man who at first glance perhaps didn't fully understand this, the more pungent my opinion, the more potentially obnoxious I become. So base your opinion on understanding and get your understanding from the people that the story is about. This shouldn't really be controversial, but I guess in a country of culture war it was guaranteed to be, up to and including the Prime Minister wading in and describing the practice that Keiki just so beautifully explained as divisive. Janet's in Lewisham. Janet, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello, Janet.
I think the words that have been spoken so far, my comments are sort of superfluous, but I'll give them anyway.
Your comments are never superfluous, Janet, in any context.
Trust me. Anyway, as a black woman, I'm a black Jamaican woman, white Jamaican mother, black Jamaican father. So I have sort of, mixed feelings on this. However, I will sit down and I will watch documentary on documentary about the Jewish situation in Germany. And I will sit there and I will weep and I will grieve. And I could watch them with anybody else around.
Right.
But I cannot watch programs about slavery. I cannot. The pain is so deep. It's a primeval pain that I find it hard to describe.
I think Helena just described it as processing generational trauma, didn't she? Which comes close, I think.
Yeah. And the only people that I could watch anything that distressing with are my own people who are feeling what I'm feeling. And I am afraid that, don't get me wrong, in general, I don't believe in only black organizations as such.
Sure.
But this case, I think, is different. This is personal, that goes to our core.
Well, I tell you, you can. I can't quite now get inside the head of the person who's got a problem with it, the white person who's got a problem with it. Inevitably, as a Daily Mail columnist who's got a problem with it today, perhaps I should have a look at her column. But Emma's point about a sort of tantrum because you're not central to every scene. How dare you tell me I can't come to the theatre in any circumstances whatsoever? Lots of people pointing out the kind of people most likely to get cross about this are not probably the kind of people who spend a lot of time in the theatre. Dave in Bournemouth says, I'm willing to bet 99.99% of those complaining had no intention of going to see this play in the first place. But do we know why anyone would get so upset about something that seems now so simple to understand?
It's very, very hard for a white person to have a level of empathy with somebody. Slavery itself, the horror of it, but the fact that growing up in this country, and I'm of the older generation, and I grew up in racism that coursed through my school and changed my whole education.
Yes.
And there are certain trigger words that if I hear them now, I get that same feeling of dread, fear, shame that I had at 7 years old. And nobody else who is not of our origin can feel that. In the same way as a Jewish person, nobody else but a Jewish person can understand when words of hate are directed towards them. So therefore, this little bit of time for us, if we're going to watch something that deep on our own history, having the opportunity to watch it with only us, I think is brilliant.
Yes, well, I mean, I do now. I was fairly confident that it was a good idea, but I'm not sure I was expecting to have the clarity delivered by you and by KK and by others quite so completely. But I would struggle now to push back on any of what you've said and any of what I've heard. There's another, of course, context to it as well, which again I don't know that I'd ever be able to fully understand, which Mark in Streatham describes as the concept of white fragility, where black people have to moderate their feelings in the company of white people for fear of causing offence or comforting white people when their feelings are hurt, which Kieran puts really well, saying, I don't want to sit there and feel pitied by white audience members. And I would not have thought of it that way around before, because you're thinking that the people who object to this are unlikely to go, and they are denying agency to people who want to sit and watch a story about their own generational trauma only in the company of people who will have full empathy for it. But actually, you don't want to be sitting next to a well-meaning white person who feels sorry for you, because you want to watch a play without having to deal with the pity of the person in the next seat. And as Kieran says, that's the best case scenario when watching these things, the pity. Sometimes we just want the space to feel feelings ourselves without having the context of white fragility or white guilt or whatever it is in the auditorium with us. Janet, thank you so much. I'm nothing remotely superfluous about any of that. Gary's in Haringey. Gary, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. A lot of the callers have already said a lot of things that I wanted to say, but years ago I watched 12 Years a Slave, and at the time I was seeing a white woman. There was a scene where the main character was brutally whipped, and it was filmed incredibly. And the pain I felt, as many of the other callers said, was visceral. I didn't just cry, I wailed.
Wow. That
generational trauma, I felt it. And I watched lots of different slave films before, but this one really, really hit me.
Right.
And my white girlfriend at the time said, "Oh, it's just a film. Just get over it. I don't understand why you're reacting this way." So I can totally understand if the slave play will elicit such feelings, why you wouldn't want to be in the company of white people. You want to be in the company of other people who experience the same thing you do, know how you feel, and you can let it out. You don't have to censor yourself, with this white fragility. You don't have to censor yourself and worry about what other white people are thinking. You're there experiencing it. Other people experience it in the same way that you're experiencing it. And I think it's just a great idea. And I think Richie Sunak weighing in and saying it's divisive, like you said, if it was a Holocaust play and it was exclusive for Jewish audiences who would feel it viscerally, like I did watching 12 Years a Slave, he wouldn't have said that at all. I've watched other films about the Holocaust, and while it is a traumatic experience, I don't feel it viscerally because I'm not Jewish. I don't have that generational trauma of the Holocaust, whereas Jewish people do. Black people have that for slavery. So I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, it's the difference, isn't it, between, I don't know what the other word is. One of the words is empathy. I think Janet used the phrase full empathy. It's the impossibility of having full empathy if there is no historical twist in which it could have been you on the screen or on the stage. And I can't watch a film about that slave trade with that feeling. I could never do that. And actually, I wonder what you make of this, actually, Gary, from Anne, who is from Anfield and can't watch a Hillsborough documentary even, let alone a dramatisation, because it was Jimmy McGovern's dramatisation that kicked off the final push for justice. She says, unless I'm with people who already understand the horror and the pain, I want to tell them that those people on the screen are my family. Do you understand? They are my people. And she can't watch it in a room with people who aren't part of that. Does that resonate with you?
Because she would have to, if it's not people who have family from Liverpool or connections to Liverpool, you're having to explain everything to them. You're having to explain the trauma and why it feels so terrible to you. Whereas if you're in a room full of people who already have that connection, there's no explanation. You already get it. I am you, you are me, you understand. We have this understanding, this tacit understanding without having to explain it.
Yeah.
So I totally get what she's saying.
Do you, and I'm not sure it's fair to ask you this, but do you have any inkling of why somebody would be upset about this or cross about this, whether it's Rishi Sunak or whether it's a Daily Mail columnist or a kind of, a rent-a-gob?
Well, it's like you said, it is because they are not the centre of attention. They're not the centre of the story. Other people are now the centre of the story, and they have to insert themselves into that to make themselves feel important. You can't just step back and say, you know what, this is all about you. I'm just going to let you experience this on your own terms. No, I have to be part of it. And if I'm not part of it, then I'm going to make a fuss and I'm going to throw a tantrum and make it about me.
It's just infantile, isn't it, actually? And something that you don't have to do, because by thinking about it and by listening to people like you and Janet and KK and all of our texters, the clouds should clear. It's about a will to understand, a desire to understand. Gary, thank you. I'll read one more text because Evgenia Karamirza is joining us after this. I just get this text out there. When I was 8, writes Zara, I went to see The Diary of Anne Frank on a school trip to the theatre. I had very little connection to the fact that I was Jewish, as I was raised in a non-Jewish area with zero religious aspect to my life. However, there was a moment in the play that triggered some sort of primitive ancestral grief. It was a wave of grief that came from somewhere below the depth of my stomach, and I was crying inconsolably in the theatre. I had no idea why. Nobody around me understood why. And I didn't until years later when I learned about inherited trauma. And that, I think, is almost a complete clarification of a not, it turned out, very complicated story that some people remain determined to use for unpleasant reasons, is the best way I can think about saying it. Possibly they don't realise they're being unpleasant or they're just being ignorant rather than malevolent. But you'd hope a Prime Minister would know better, wouldn't you? If not a Daily Mail columnist. It's 11:47.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 11:51, and it is extraordinary, really, to see scenes of Alexei Navalny's funeral currently taking place in Moscow. And I say that as someone who is simply an observer of Vladimir Putin's murderous regime. I'm joined in the studio now by a woman who is much, much more than that. Evgenia Karamirza is a Russian human rights activist and wife of the man who, I hate saying this, Evgenia, but he's the man who essentially became the most prominent political prisoner in Russia after Navalny was murdered. I speak, of course, of your husband, Vladimir. So if it's difficult for outsiders to watch this funeral today in Moscow, I dread to think what it's like for you.
Hello, James. It's good to see you.
Always.
Although it's heartbreaking for me that every time we meet, it's under those very difficult circumstances. And because of those circumstances, because I am here, because my husband is in jail in Siberia, sentenced to 25 years of strict regime for having continuously opposed Vladimir Putin's regime and exposed his crimes. But that is how any kind of opposition is seen in today's Russia by the Russian authorities. All these people are represented, are being portrayed by the regime as spies, traitors, and criminals, sometimes insane people. Because just like in the Soviet times, there are no dissenters in the country, just a very large number of criminal spies and traitors. And it is hard for me to come to terms with yet another political assassination carried out by this regime. Although, on the one hand, it's not surprising. I mean, the regime has been using these tactics for years. Novaya Gazeta alone, this Nobel Peace Prize winner, Novaya Gazeta, an independent Russian media, lost 6 employees to political assassinations over the years. A leader of the Russian opposition, Boris Nemtsov, my husband's mentor and friend and our daughter's godfather, was assassinated in front of the Kremlin walls in 2015. My husband survived 2 assassination attacks through poisoning before he ended up behind bars for 25 years. And Alexei Navalny also survived a poisoning attack with Novichok and then was thrown in prison, tortured for 3 years, and now the regime finally killed him. And those political assassinations are also being carried out outside of the Russian territory. Let's not forget that we're sitting here in London, where Alexander Litvinenko was assassinated by Andrei Lugavoy, who then was awarded with a seat in Russian parliament for having successfully carried out his mission. So no, it's not surprising, but is it devastating? Yes, it is. Painful beyond words to know that we lost yet another fierce campaigner for a democratic Russia, for our country's future that is different from the one that Vladimir Putin sees fit for our country. We lost, I don't know, I know how heartbroken millions of Russians are today around the world, and I cannot imagine what Alexei's family is going through, and his wife, widow. I have to say widow now, and that word, just pronouncing it. But Yulia and their kids cannot even say goodbye to Alexei. They cannot even be there with him today.
Hundreds of people are, we should say. Give us an idea of what that means, the fact that hundreds of people have found the courage to attend upon Alexei's funeral in Moscow right now. Since yesterday I've been reading on the news and Russian independent media about all the police forces of the southeast of Moscow being brought to that particular church. The church is completely surrounded. There are notices everywhere about photography being banned and video recording being banned. Monuments and memorials to victims of political persecution are guarded across the country because those people who cannot come to Moscow to the funeral, the authorities expect that they would be coming to lay flowers in Alexei's memory to these memorials, to these monuments, and they're being heavily guarded. So imagine how afraid this regime is of Alexei even dead. How afraid it is of any dissenting voice that exposes the regime's crimes. And I can say that I am proud of all my compatriots who, despite repression, despite the methods used by the regime against them, and those methods include all the Soviet instruments, like punitive psychiatry today, torture, physical, psychological torture, sexual harassment. Despite all of that, people continue coming out to lay flowers. People continue their protest
in any ways possible, and I'm very proud of those thousands and thousands of people across our country.
You distill a spirit there, Evgenia. You describe and distill a spirit, a human spirit, which is the same spirit, of course, which saw Vladimir, your husband, return to Russia, knowing that he would almost certainly be jailed, ostensibly for speaking out against the war in Ukraine. I read yesterday morning, that you have a meeting with the Foreign Secretary David Cameron scheduled. I think what because people may not realise that Vladimir, your husband, has a British passport. He's a dual citizen. He is a British passport holder. Studied history at Trinity Hall. What really simple, meaningful action, as opposed to words, could the British government take in defence of support of your husband?
Well, the meeting is scheduled for today, and again, the timing that while I'm going to be meeting Lord Cameron today, Alexei's been buried in Moscow. That is just beyond any words. Although this meeting was scheduled before Alexei's murder. Well, I do believe that the approach, the policy, the UK policy with regard to hostages and political prisoners has to change. Because saying that we do not engage does not work anymore. It is not acceptable in the civilized world of the 21st century. It is not acceptable in a democratic country, because whether governments engage or not, the number of hostages and political prisoners around the world is on the rise. And imagine what kind of a signal, what kind of a message the UK government sends to its citizens, that if you end up in a situation like this, sorry, but you're on your own, because we do not engage. This is not acceptable anymore. And I believe that a more consistent, a more responsible approach is needed today. And if dictators can pull their efforts together and adopt each other's practices and prop each other's regimes, democracies should also work together to find proactive ways to address the rising crisis of hostages. There should be some instruments used together by the global democratic community to prevent dictators around the world from taking more hostages and to engage in such malign practices. And I don't believe that the citizenship, I'm sorry, James, but I don't believe that the citizenship should be the deciding thing in this. No. Because it is morally right to stand with those who are being oppressed for the same values this country is built on. Any democratic democracy is built on the respect for human rights and the absolute value of human life. And so it is, I believe, the duty, the responsibility of the global democratic community to stand with those people who are being oppressed in their own countries for fighting for the same values, for the same rights that are guaranteed to the citizens of those democratic countries. I hope, for what I hope to achieve in today's meeting, I see the willingness of the Foreign Secretary to meet with me. I mean, it's been 2 years.
Sure.
And the UK has gone through a number of foreign secretaries in that time. You have very entertaining politics, and I have to say that I'm very envious. We've had the same decrepit murderer in power for a quarter of a century. You go through 3 or 4 foreign secretaries. I'll stop counting at some point.
At least.
Yes, in 2 years. And that is entertaining, at least.
But it's not ideal for someone in your situation, is it? Because you need relationships to be built up in order for interventions to be made.
But first of all, we need political will,
of course,
to be there. And this is the fact that this meeting is to take place is a sign for me that this political will is finally there to maybe be more actively engaged, more proactively engaged in advocacy for the release of political prisoners.
And I think both Liz Truss and James Cleverly declined to meet with you despite your pleas, which of course reminds us of Richard Ratcliffe, who went on hunger strike outside the Foreign Office in the hope of getting the British government to intervene on behalf of his imprisoned wife, Nazanin. I hate asking you this question, but I have to ask you again because some of the people listening won't have heard you answer it before. But when Vladimir decided in 2022 to go back to Russia, knowing what was on the horizon, and indeed I know you can't speak for Alexei, but his decision also to expose himself to almost inevitable imprisonment at least. Why is it so important to them and for them to be there and not to be agitating from here?
Because this regime, as any murderous, repressive regime, is built on fear, intimidation, repression. And because Vladimir believes that because people are afraid, he needed to go there and stand with them and say, look at me, I am not afraid. I'm standing by your side and I'm not afraid. And Alexei did the exact same thing.
Evgenia Karamerza, thank you.
Thank you, James.
It's 3 minutes after 12.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
6 minutes after 12 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where you will understand why the studio is quite a sombre place at the moment. Evgenia is an incredible woman, married to an incredible man, and I apologise for that sort of minor loss of control when I reflected upon the fact in Evgenia's company that Vladimir, her husband, when Alexei Navalny was murdered, became the most prominent opposition politician in Russia, whether imprisoned or not. That is now the mantle that Vladimir must carry, but he will carry it with, if you weren't aware of him or indeed his wife before today, you will know now that he will carry it with quite extraordinary courage. Absolute point there that he cannot ask other Russians to stand up to Putin if he is not prepared to take the same risks as them. Because you sit here, and I've asked Evgenia, I've asked other Russian opposition politicians, why do you go back? And yet the answer is unerringly simple, because you cannot ask anybody to stand up to Vladimir Putin unless you prove that you are prepared to do it yourself. And you can only do that in person. You can only do that on Russian soil. Looking to my right, I see more footage coming from Moscow, which is going to be filmed on phones and I almost surreptitiously, given the state of the policing of the event. But the funeral has now taken place in Moscow. 8 minutes after 12 is the time. I think a complete change now of pace, a complete change of tone as well. It's our final hour of the week together, unless, of course, you download Full Disclosure, which I'll tell you a little bit more about shortly. Suffice to say, last week's guest was Bernie Sanders, wasn't it? I think it was. Or was that the week before? No, I'm pretty sure last week was Bernie Sanders. This week's guest is one of the few occasions where someone I hadn't really heard of and didn't know much about, but entirely on your recommendation, I found that whenever we were discussing economic matters, this name would pop up in my inbox. It would ping up there quite regularly. So I looked into it and a few months ago and discovered that he had a book coming out this week. So I thought, well, we'll get him on Full Disclosure then. But a guy called Gary Stevenson, who made a ton of money in the city, has an incredible backstory from the mean streets of Ilford all the way to the sort of metaphorical top of Canary Wharf, trading in Japan. A huge talent, deeply fascinating man, and now a tireless campaigner for equality. And some of his explanations of inequality and unfairness sit almost perfectly with some of the explanations that Bernie Sanders, the American presidential candidate, shared with us on last week's Full Disclosure. So it almost looks like we planned this stuff. But I'll play you a clip or two of Gary's interview later. But I want to turn your attention next to a subject that, you know, can you even remember the time we spent together before politics went bananas? I mean, what did we talk about in sort of 2013, for example, or 2009? It's hard to remember, but we've always been fascinated by childhood obesity on this programme for two reasons, the personal and the political. The personal being the headline today. There are two headlines today that speak to this story, and I see them as almost inseparable from each other. The first is that 1.3 million obese children British children face, quotes, shorter and unhappier lives because they are too fat. This is a rise despite all the best efforts of both public health and some prominent individuals, motivated in some cases. And I sometimes put this a little unkindly. When I say that if you've got a problem with Jamie Oliver, for example, then you put yourself at risk of sounding as if you care less about your children's long-term health than he does. And he's never met them. But despite the best efforts of people like Jamie, we're looking at an increase in obesity rates. Over 3 decades, they've nearly tripled, with the sharpest increase seen in boys. This is published in the Lancet at the moment. But the other story, which comes from Tim Spector, the founder of that nutrition app Zoe that so many people are availing themselves of at the moment, he has been in Parliament describing Britain as the sick man of Europe. And that fascinated me because I don't know that we do enough on the specifics of Britain's problem with obesity. Do you remember that menu we got sent a few months ago from a French school? As a parent of a child at a French school, and we couldn't, you and I couldn't quite believe that it was real. And that's a really interesting thing, because that almost immediate skepticism, just thinking, so that someone will send me another one now and I'll be able to read it to you. That's, by the way, a polite request, 84850. And no, I don't mean the producer. I mean you listening in France with your thing on the fridge about what the kids are going to get at school this week. You can take a picture of it and send it to me. You can WhatsApp it now, can't you? To 03456060973. And I can even open it in the studio. I think it's amazing. This technology, but the shock was real, wasn't it? The shock was completely sincere. The children were being fed an incredibly rich and varied diet, rich in a good way. Varied diet in school every single day. If that was the only meal they were having in school, if they were coming home and having a bag of frites, you see what I did there? A little bit of bilingualism. They're coming home and having a bag of frites and sac de frites, then they'd still be eating more healthily than most British children. And I just thought it was staggering. And it really drove home to me the failure over the years to discuss obesity from a very peculiarly British perspective. So it's our dependence on ultra-processed food that is the problem. Tim Spector, has likened it to passive smoking, talking about the need for a dramatic overhaul of government guidelines. And you'd be surprised. In fact, I'm going to tease you a bit. You'd be very surprised at some of the things he identifies as being the worst offenders in this field. Because some of them you might think were either healthy or relatively ambivalent. But I shall share with you the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the worst offenders in this field, of which I would suggest at least 3 you would probably be surprised to see on this list of what most to avoid. And listen, his point is not so much about obesity as poor health, which often go hand in hand. But when you're talking about processed food, you're also looking at outcomes including diabetes, cancer, heart disease, depression, all sorts of problems linked to low nutrition, linked to poor diets. But the question of what Britain has done so wrong is one that we haven't really asked before. And I want you to tell me. I tell you what I really want. I sound like a Spice Girl now. I'll tell you what I want, what I really, really want. I want to hear from people who haven't always lived here about your reaction to discovering what passed for normal nutrition-wise in Britain. So whether you come from the Middle East or Middle Europe or Middle America or South America, wherever you come from, the chances are, I think Malta might be an exception to this for reasons that I'm not entirely clear about. I hope I haven't just offended Malta. Always, when I wake up in the morning, do my very best not to offend an entire country before lunchtime. But you come here from somewhere else, or you spent a lot of time somewhere else. You were born here, but you went and spent a few years. What were your impressions of what passes for normal in the context of British food? Because I want to have a look. I want to do that would some power the gifty gears to see ourselves as others see us. I've stopped trying to do that Rabbie Burns quote in a Scottish accent because people are quite rude, very rude, in fact, about my my thespian skills. But you know that idea sometimes that you need to see what you look like from the outside to get a really clear idea of what you look like. So what did you think when you saw the British diet? Up front, face first. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. It's 16 minutes after 12. We've got a massive obesity problem. We have a massive Britain-specific problem with processed foods and similar. I want to know why. Why has this little island had these waves of poor health and obesity washing up on our shores on levels that are not really seen in other countries? Other countries have got problems, but right here, we seem to have managed to be the worst of all possible worlds. So I want the why of it. Why is Britain so susceptible to this problem, to these problems? 0345 6060 973. But I also want, and I'm getting some great texts through, James has been in touch. He says, I've got a house in Malta, James. The kids are massive. I don't know why I've got it in my head somewhere that Maltese children have an even bigger obesity problem than British children. But James, anecdotally at least, would seem to endorse my idea. Lots of you sending me school menus from other countries. I shall have a look. And as Jim tells us, just go onto YouTube and have a look for French school dinners. It's a blooming revelation. It really is. So that's part of the answer to the question. But it doesn't answer the question of how we ended up living in a tyranny of turkey twizzlers. So why has Britain got this all so bad historically? But I think it would be really helpful to hear how shocked you were if you moved here, for example, from France or from Italy. You moved here and you couldn't quite believe what we thought were actual meals, whether school meals or home meals. You couldn't quite believe. What was the thing that shocked you most? It might have been Greggs. I love Greggs, don't get me wrong. But if you come from France, the idea that where you have a patisserie, we have a Greggs must have been quite shocking. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. So I want comparisons and impressions, please. Not impressions like, Frank Spencer. Oh, Betty. No, impressions of British diet. Your first impressions of the Guys, it's taken me 18 minutes to get that. Your first impressions of the British diet, please, as someone who either came here afresh or came back from afar. 0345 6060 973. And then, please, your answer to the question of why has Britain ended up getting this so horribly wrong? I can just see my first call coming in from Malta. So,
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
21 minutes after 12 is the time. The Brits and obesity. What do we look like from where you are? I.e., not necessarily someone who's lived their entire life here. And how have we ended up getting it so wrong? 22 after 12 is the time. Geraldine is in Waltham Forest. Geraldine, what would you like to say?
Yes, hi.
Hello.
So I'm French and I've lived here for a long time. I've brought up 2 children here. And what I've noticed is that you treat children like they're not normal human beings. They don't eat the same food as everybody else. So you do separate diets, like fish fingers. I mean, I've never bought, when they were little. So then that's what they get used to. We don't have children's menu at the restaurant because even a 2-year-old will try a bit of everybody's dish. We don't give different food to children, and that means they get used to eating the same as everybody. Whereas what I'm noticing is that people will post, oh, my child only likes fish fingers, but that's because you gave fish fingers from the start. Whereas we don't have that. We just give normal food.
I remember being really cross in France that I found it hard to feed my children. But actually, that was a me problem, not a you problem, wasn't it?
Well, it just makes it much easier because if you don't introduce it, you don't get used to it. You just get used to normal food.
And you managed to resist this, did you, while raising your children here?
It's not even that I would resist it. It's that would be totally absurd to me. Plus, it gives you a lot more work. So then the other thing to compensate.
I like this because I mean, essentially, you're introducing the notion of having a better diet because of laziness.
Well, no. Well, yes, exactly. Because what I noticed is that people around me started buying cookbooks for children, which I'd never seen in my life. So you're basically putting a lot of stress on yourself. You're then cooking. Then if the child doesn't eat it, you're resentful. Whereas actually, it's much easier to just give the food you're eating that you've cooked for everybody, because then you're not stressed about it if they're eating it, because you've created a whole lot of work and complication for yourself.
I mean, you're right, I suppose. Part of it also is timing. We often feed the kids at 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in this country, and then sit down for the adult dinner at 7, 8 o'clock.
We don't do that.
No, I know.
It's very shocking, this, to me, because why would you not eat with your children?
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, you keep using the word "you." I'm feeling quite persecuted here, Geraldine.
Not you. One. I mean, one.
No, I know exactly. You mean the British, the generalised British family. You accurately describe, but I feel quite defensive. I feel I need to say, no, we don't. We always sit down and eat together. But actually, Rosalind, who's in Basildon even. No, not Rosalind. I beg your pardon. Susanna says, I'm Swedish, and my first impression of Brits was that you only seem to cook a proper meal on Sunday. And that's what you're describing in France. You'd have a meal like our Sunday lunch every day. Not. I don't mean a meat and 2 veg, but I mean everyone eating the same thing and everyone sitting down together to eat it.
That's it.
There
and it's just a habit, really.
Yes, but where does it come from? Well, I wonder why. I mean, we're not that far apart. It's just La Manche that divides us. So why would Le Noche be consumed so differently? What happened in Britain that actually rendered us doing what you describe, as opposed to French families still having that meal? And we haven't even touched on schools. Thank you, Geraldine. The perfect start. Helen is in Mougins, in France. Is that the place with all the restaurants?
It is indeed, James. Yes,
you must eat like an empress, do you? How often do you?
Oh, every day. No, we don't do that.
But it is
occasionally.
It is a culinary cornucopia, isn't it? Yes, I do. I know that. I've even been there. What can you tell us then from that perspective?
Well, whenever we come back, we've lived there for probably 17, 18 years, and we do also have a little house in England, in Marlow, which we're heading back
to
now.
Which is also a gastronomic centre.
It must be. I think it's a theme, isn't it?
You lucky person. You go pop in and see Heston when you're there.
Tom Kerridge.
Sorry, I bet, of course it's Tom Kerridge. What am I talking about? Pop in and see Tom Kerridge at the Hand and Flowers. Chris Evans going past in his canoe, no doubt, from his bit of... What a lovely... Oh, you've got it sorted, haven't you? Had a flipping, eh? Talk about La Dolce Vita.
It's all roses. I've got all the fun going on.
So go on, what have you seen? What have you learned? What can you tell us?
What we've learned is that when you get to England, one, you're shocked by the size of people, which is, sad to see.
Yes.
Terribly shocked. And the other thing is that food's available any time of day. So you can have a full English breakfast if you want at 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
Yes.
Or whatever you want. And the French are so much more regulated about when they eat. I mean, we've just had some renovations done in our house.
Oh, yeah.
And the workmen, you offer them, because here it's always like, oh, is that the kettle I can hear on, love? There, you say, do you want a cup of coffee, cup of tea? Oh, no. We had breakfast and I will be having my lunch. They never have biscuits. They never have anything.
Why are you employing Welsh builders in France?
I thought my accent was rather good.
It was brilliant. I'm joking. So it's a completely cultural then, a completely different culture.
Very
completely different culture.
Totally, and they believe that they're interested in where it's come from, their food. The markets here every day, fresh tomatoes that taste like heaven. Everything simple is local and fresh, and they won't accept anything less than that. I mean, they're a bit stroppy about it, but
of course,
they've got a point.
What happened then? Why do we know why we went in one direction while France?
I think
than the other.
We don't have that. I think we're eating at your desk. I mean, I remember always doing that. You know, having a sandwich at your desk. You just eat rubbish because it's easier.
Yeah.
You don't stop, have a canteen as such, unless that doesn't really exist much anymore.
No.
You would be able to have a cooked meal. All of that stuff's changed. Consumerism is much more, I think, in the UK. We see it much more.
France has actively resisted it, I think. Certainly in the context of fast food. You don't see anything like as many outlets on French streets as you do here.
Not at all, not at all. I mean, that's not to say that there aren't, you know, there isn't good food as well. You can eat well.
Of course.
But we are looking forward to a bacon sandwich. Good God, can't wait for a bacon butty. But
I had one this morning.
You know, you want. Oh,
I don't
but see, that's
often do
the thing, the comfort.
Yeah.
I think weather has something to do with it as well, because when the weather's cold and red, you want carbs, you want to carb up, all that sort of stuff.
But even then, you can go and carb up at a patisserie, and you're not going to be buying processed bread, which is one of the things that Tim Spector identifies as being among the worst, the stuff that we think is normal, even the stuff that's brown or has got seeds in and we think it's good for us. If it's got preservatives in it to extend shelf life and lots of added sugar as well, then it's not good for you at all. It's quite bizarre. What's the biggest difference? Do you eat the same in France and England just because of the way you operate, or do you notice yourself slipping a bit when you're here?
I think we do change a bit. We're in the UK. When we don't, listen, we are still
of course
British, so we do eat British food, but we are more aware of things like, I mean, obviously we live in the Mediterranean, so the Mediterranean diet is full of lovely fresh vegetables and fruits and salads and all that kind of thing. And it's good for your
blood pressure. It's less likely to get diabetes. All of these things are thank you, Helen. I'm actually quite jealous of your existence. That doesn't happen on the programme very often, but those Marlowe's are absolutely beautiful, and so is Moujane. What an absolutely perfect combination. 12:30 is the time. Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 12:34. Rosalind says it's our country's strange love affair with all things American. Even most American recipes tend to be rather sweet, and also our weird dislike of European food. Yes, I mean, you can sort of do that sort of cliched Brexiter, couldn't you, with I don't eat foreign muck. I want good old-fashioned English food like chicken tikka masala. There is something in that. I wonder if we do have a form of culinary jingoism, but that doesn't explain what we're describing, because the French are awful like that for thinking that only French cuisine is up to sniff. So why? I'd love to know that. We're still doing impressions, not like that, just like that. No, not like that. We're still doing impressions, but I also want answers, actually. Insights, please. Impressions and insights. On why has Britain gone off in this weird direction? Bread in particular, this habit of buying this. My dad used to call it standing water. The bread that has got very little nutritional value in it. And I've become a bit boring lately. Yes, lately. I read ingredients now. Emulsifier. Even if you think you're buying fancy bread, if you're buying it in the supermarket and it's in a plastic bag and it's all wrapped up. Even I was in the supermarket the other day and I wanted to buy a fresh baguette, and that had emulsifier. It was still warm, but it had emulsifier in it. I was reading somewhere that the emulsifier. You know what emulsifier is? It emulsifies stuff. So you're basically thickening a liquid, making it more emulsion-like. And it will do that in your tummy as well. So that's why it's on Professor Spector's list. Packaged bread. And the stuff you'd expect to be there, soft drinks, the citric and phosphoric acid in there, as well as the sugars and preservatives. You probably know the diet versions, health-wise, can actually be even worse. This is more about processed food than obesity-causing food, although it's a Venn diagram. Processed meat, which is, anything that's not just a joint of meat, really, or a chop, sausages, bacon, anything that's cured or processed, let alone, a ready meal lasagna or something like that. You'd expect that to be on the list. But the stuff that's often surprising to people includes cereal, breakfast cereal, ultra-processed, Even if it's high in fibre, it will contain loads of sugar. And plant-based burgers. So somehow you think that a vegetarian product, a plant-based burger, will be not just better than meat, but actively healthy. Quite often it will just be soya protein held together by, wait for it, emulsifiers and flavourings. So why has Britain gone down such a weird path? I want a history lesson as well as a home economics lesson today. Edward's in Fishguard. Edward, what made you pick up the phone?
Good afternoon, James. Well, the last call was covered pretty much everything that I wanted to say, really.
Well, you could have hung up, mate. Don't want to be repetitious. No, it's lovely to hear from you. It's lovely to hear from you. Always good to hear from Fishguard.
Most kind. Well, I was briefly explaining to the chap I was talking to you on the phone earlier that in 1999 I moved from the UK to Luxembourg.
Okay.
And then I worked with their profession in Luxembourg. Then I moved to Germany. Then I moved to France. And I moved back to Luxembourg again and have a son still living in Luxembourg. So I have a modest amount of experience in those three countries, food-wise, and a number. It is as the lady said earlier. It's culture. For me, it is culture. For example, you don't go into a supermarket and see 56,000 different flavours in parentheses, of crisps. There's salted or there's paprika. And that's pretty much about it. You don't get kumquat and lychee surprise. You just don't guess.
Different ways of selling us more stuff, a sort of dedication to getting quite. Why do you think historically though? Because we can sit here, as you say, all day pinpointing the cultural difference, but when and why have we gone down such an odd and unhealthy path?
Well, I mean, the whole family concept is obviously, as most people are aware, it's very, very, very huge in Europe. People sit down, the slow eating movement, etc. And and on Sundays,
they got him. They got him. Is that part of the answer to the question? But then I just changed the question. You know what I'm like. Then I'll just say, well, why don't we sit? We used to sit down and eat together as kids. Was Geraldine really early doors onto something when she talked? Why do we feed our kids differently from ourselves? That might be the beginning of the answer to the question. Where does that come from? Is that a Victorian throwback? And children are seen and not heard. The nursery. You'd have nursery food. We'd call it nursery food. I bet that's the origin story for Geraldine's fish fingers, or doigts de poisson, as the French probably don't call them. Roberta is in Bristol. Roberta, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello, Roberta.
Well, I moved to Bristol 8 years ago from Italy.
Okay.
At the time, I had 3 kids going to school.
Yes.
And when they started school, I was shocked that, for example, in the vegetable area, or when they were in the canteen, there were olives like an option.
They were.
And my daughter, sometimes the only vegetable that she could eat at school were olives.
Olives?
Yes.
But I'm surprised. I thought you were complaining about the lack of olives, but you're complaining about a lack of everything except olives.
Exactly.
So they're olives. Is an olive a vegetable? I suppose it is, isn't it?
I think.
No, of course it is. Of course it's a vegetable.
Fruit.
Well, because it's got a stone in it. But anyway, we're getting. I think you've taken me slightly by surprise on this. I've never heard of olives on school dinner menu. Where did they go to school? Did they go to some fancy lycée or something like that?
Well, at the time, my husband's company was paying for a posh private school.
Well, there you go. I was going to say, I didn't have an olive until I was 43 years old, Roberta. Honestly. Do you know that when I was young, you could only buy olive oil in the chemist? You couldn't buy it in the supermarket. You had to go to the chemist because you used it to soften your earwax before having your ears syringed at the doctor's. Same with garlic. You could only get Dorothy. My friend Dorothy's been in touch. When her mum came over from Poland, she went to buy some garlic and got sent to the chemist to buy garlic and olive oil, which as an Italian, you pretty much have in the cradle. So why do you think the Brits have got it so wrong compared to the Italians? What do you think?
I'm sure everything people before me told is right. The habit not to eat altogether for Mediterranean Latin people, the moment of the meal is really a socially important in the family.
Yes.
It's a moment that we share all together. We sit all together. We take the time to share, to talk about our day, and to
why did we stop
something
doing that?
good.
Why did we
it's
stop
not just
doing
feeding.
That? No, I know it's a moment. I mean, French school meals are a scheduled hour, and everybody chats and talks and have different courses, and there's always a piece of fruit. But I wonder why we didn't. Roberta, thank you. Yes, the Industrial Revolution, a couple of people have suggested. We were the first to lose touch with where food comes from. Foraging, still common in France, is a hippie counterculture here. And there was a great programme a while back called The Victorian Baker. I saw a bit of that, which described the decline of healthy bread. But you wouldn't have to have that. You could go to, France's boulangerie is an intrinsic part of any community. And so you'd buy fresh bread every day, but if you were working in a factory, you couldn't. Is there something in that? I don't know. But we've gone down a weird avenue, and I don't know that I understand why. Gary's been a bit rude, mate. Olives are a fruit, you nutter. Why are you calling me a nutter? All right. What's olive oil then? A vegetable oil or a fruit oil? Yeah, exactly. It's a vegetable oil, isn't it? But I think technically you're right. When I said, Jimmy in Fulham, that I was Dorothy's friend, I meant literally my friend Dorothy, who I used to work with at the Daily Telegraph, at the Daily Express, had been in touch with tales of her mother's experiences when she came here from Poland. I don't know what you're going on about. Christophe is in Millau, is that right? Millau?
Yes, that's right, Millau.
France?
We've got a really big viaduct designed by Sir Norman Foster.
Have you really?
Viaduct.
Oh, how exciting.
Yeah.
Viaduct?
Yeah, it's
Fantastic.
the biggest
I love a
viaduct in the world, I think.
Is it really? I love viaducts.
Yeah.
Do you know that, Christophe, there's a viaduct in Kidderminster, a Victorian viaduct, which is a thing of beauty as well.
Okay.
You don't sound that interested, mate. Well, talk to me about food, not viaducts.
Exactly. Yes, I lived in England 20 years, and when I left, I was a tour catering manager when Jamie Oliver came on, and it all happened, and I think it was down to price really, because it cost a lot of money, and you look at school meal in France about €3-4, where in England people were only spending £1.50 or not even that.
How many roads lead to cuts? These vampires on Tufton Street trying to get governments and councils to spend less and less and less money. How do you think it's going to end? It's going to end with turkey Twizzlers, isn't it?
Well, yeah, because if they got no money for education and things like that, food's going to be cut off. Yeah. And then you had vending machines in school. How can you have vending machines selling fizzy drinks and sodas? It's not good for anyone, is it?
No, it's not.
Did
you enjoy your work, or did you find it very frustrating being a school's catering manager?
No, it was really good, because I was recruited to implement all the Jamie Oliver changes. So it was really very interesting.
Really?
And yeah.
Did you meet much? Did you meet much resistance?
Sorry?
Did you meet much resistance?
No, not really. I think everyone was on board, really. And
I think
from the teachers, from all the boards. I think it's changed now, and I've gone back to France now. So
and the difference. What's the difference between a French? Describe the average French school meal. Well, maybe you don't know. Maybe you're not a school's catering manager anymore.
But basically, they get like a starter, main course, bit of cheese, and then fruit and a bit of cake.
It's just a bit of cake as well, a bit of gâteau at the end.
Yeah, that's right.
So a starter, a main course, balanced and nutritious, a little bit of fruit, a little bit of cheese. It's good for your calcium. Margaret Thatcher, of course, took milk away when she was Education Secretary from British children. I mean, it is an absolutely extraordinary contrast. And we'd do a phone in another day on the historical reasons for it, because none of them jump out at you. Do you know what potatoes boulangère or boulangerie potatoes? Do you know what that is? It's when you take your potatoes to the baker's and he'd stick them in the bottom of the oven for you. Or he'd finish baking bread, but the oven was still hot. And you could take your potatoes there. So that idea, there's no reason why northern France, you go to, Brittany or Normandy, the difference meteorology, the weather is there's no reason why we should be so bad at this. But hey ho, we are. 12:46 is the time.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 12:50, and there's a real mystery here for me about why Britain has gone in the direction that it's gone. Compared to other European countries, we've got a major obesity issue. And even if you weren't doing comparisons with other countries, internationally, we're not that bad, really. In the 80s, I think, about 85, 86. But 1.3 million children destined to live shorter, unhappier lives because they are too fat, according to a study published in The Lancet today. That's cause for concern. But the international comparison on health and processed food, which is a slightly different conversation, is a truly intriguing one. The more Americanized a society is, the more likely it is to have an obesity issue. South Pacific Islands, way, way, way ahead of the curve on obesity. I don't know why that is. But I'm wondering why, when we look at European countries, southern and northern, actually, we have gone down a really odd path, especially with bread. I just sort of thinking of bread. And the Germans have loads of different types. Because normally, if you're trying to find the closest parallel for our eating habits, Germany, it does a pretty good job on some fronts. So, a lot of processed meat, a lot of sausage, all that kind of thing. But on bread, they've got pumpernickel coming out their ears. And yet we're all about sliced loaf. So why have we gone down that weird road? I'm going to play you a clip from Full Disclosure first, because I don't want to run out of time. And I really want you to listen to this week's. Gary Stevenson is a fascinating bloke. You may have seen him on YouTube doing Gary's Economics. He went to the same university as me, although we come from very different backgrounds, as we touch on. He's written a superb book I'll tell you more about after you've heard this. But this is someone who essentially beat the city. He went into the city and made a ton of money betting on essentially economic predictions. So betting on, for example, the fact that we didn't come out of the pandemic and suddenly have a massive economic boost. He understands why. He made his first fortune betting on the economic difficulties post-2008 after the crash, on what would happen to interest rates and what would happen to the value, for example, of commodities. He's one of the best explainers of that stuff I've ever come across, and it's somewhere where I need quite a lot of hand-holding to get my head around stuff. But then he had a massive moment of disillusionment. He writes very powerfully about a breakdown because he could see the inequality from which he profited, betting on things happening which would deliver fortunes to him. He didn't cause them, but he made fortunes from them. And yet this idea that's been developing on this show in recent years, this sense that really, really major wealth is now accruing the middle class, as opposed to previous generations where the middle class would expect to do better than their Anyway, he's one of the best people I've ever come across for explaining some of the stuff that just seems to be moving to the surface now here whenever we talk about these kind of things. So here it is. This week's episode of Full Disclosure is with the inequality economist and the former city trader, Gary Stevenson.
I lost a lot of money in 1 week in 2010, I was 23. And as the sort of diligent former LSE student that I went back to the books and I started bringing my books in, trying to read through what happened. And this Scouso I sat next to, he let me do it like one day, he let me do it a second day. And I could tell he was getting a bit about it. Third day, just slams the book out of my hand, slams it on the floor. What are you doing, mate? Does this look like fucking Jack and Nori to you? And it was like, look, how old are you? And I was like, 23. He's like, you're not a kid, mate. The answer's not in them books.
Right.
If you want to understand the economy, go home and ask your mum.
Yeah.
Ask your friends' mums. Ask about their financial situations. Look at the advertisements on the tube. Walk down the high street. What shops are closing down? What shops are opening up? That's the economy. The economy is the real world. That's where you're going to get it. And I think the only reason this guy thought like this is because he didn't go to university, really. Where you're sort of trained that it's numbers and you have to invert a matrix to work out the economy, which is kind of obviously absurd, right? And I described that in the book as the most important thing I ever heard, and I think it definitely me for my career, it was. And I started, you go and you ask people.
And you discover that they're not just struggling.
What you find out if you ask, I mean, back then I was in my 20s, I'm older now, obviously. It's a generation of people whose parents own homes who will never own homes.
Yeah.
That's what you see. And how can you turn around to a kid who will never own a home, whose parents owned a home, and said, why don't you spend more money?
It's a breach of the social contract, because the time was for parents' generations, in return for time, you give me all your time and you get property in return.
Yeah.
And that's broken. You're right. This is one of the things, I think these are the times when people have contacted my show to say you've got to speak to Gary Stevenson, because there still seems to be a very widespread failure to understand the significance of what you've just described. The cessation of traffic coming back in this direction in return for me giving you. So they were, why aren't young people working?
Yeah.
Well, you know, mental health is an issue, but equally, what do you want them to work for? Survival now.
You know, increasingly, the thing that matters overwhelmingly for the financial outcomes of individuals is not their work. It's not how hard they studied. It's not what subject they did. It's how rich their dad is and how much they inherit.
And it's worse now than it was when I was young and when you were young.
It's much worse.
Much truer now.
What you get as a result is you get micro level social mobility, which is I can get richer than the guy who grew up next to me, but I can never get a house.
Yeah.
So I can never actually take that big step up.
Yeah.
There's no big picture social mobility. And I think that's, you combine that with this culture that tells people you are your financial outcomes. That is the disaster for mental health. If you tell people, if you don't afford it, and the thing is, I've got mates, right? I went to grammar school. Not everyone's from a rich background. The kids from poor backgrounds, you know, single parent families, they're working hard. This guy buys a house, nice big £1 million house. And this kid's like, I don't understand how he got the house. Well, that kid got 600 grand gift from his mum. But he doesn't go out and post on Instagram, I got 600 grand gift from my mum. And then kids from poor families, struggling, they don't see that really all that's happening is inheritance. Really, now, if you're working for your money, you've already lost. The game's finished. Capitalism's over.
It's hardcore, and it's a really, really good book as well. But it was one of those interviews. Actually, that's two in a fortnight, isn't it? It was a bit like Joe Biden, except with Joe Biden, I was limited on time. With Gary, we did just over an hour, but I could have carried on all day. He's got one of those brains that you just want to absorb understanding from, but he's also got a great gift of explaining himself. So do have a proper listen to that. The book is called The Trading Game, with the subtitle A Confession. It's an extraordinary story told in incredibly human language, but he is also a massively successful city trader, which puts him in a very different position from those of us who perhaps preach inequality from a position of idealism, or even sometimes it may seem ignorance. He really, really knows what he's talking about. And I think that in a slightly less in a society that wasn't, where media wasn't very much in the possession of precisely the sort of wealth that he just described, he'd probably be a considerably more famous man than he currently is. But anyway, have a listen to that and buy the book as well. That's nice. I like plugging books on the show, but there's one I haven't plugged for the whole show today. No, it's gone. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, the official LBC app, where you can also pause and rewind live radio. Download it now for free from your app store, or head to globalplayer.com. Tom Sawbury will be with you at 4 on LBC, but now it's time for Sangeeta Maiska.
James O'Brien on LBC.